Salams from the People's Dispatch studios in New Delhi. I'm Siddhantani and you're watching Daily Debrief, where we take you beyond the headlines on some of the most important news stories of the day. It's good to be back on the show after a brief break amid, of course, the COVID-19 crisis. And you can see the setup is slightly different. That's because we've also reduced our staff only to essential members, those who have to come in. The rest will be joining us via video conference. Today, we're talking about 20 years. We're marking 20 years of the Guantanamo Bay detention facility. We're talking about the largest telescope ever sent to space and getting an update on the COVID-19 pandemic. First up, the United States unleashed what it called a global war on terror in response to the September 11, 2001 attacks on US soil. I quote Letta Taylor, an associate crisis and conflict director at Human Rights Watch and co-author of a new report on the costs of this war. I quote, "Around the world, Guantanamo remains one of the most enduring symbols of the injustice, abuse, and disregard for the rule of law that the US unleashed in response to the 9/11 attacks." End quote. People's Dispatch's Abdul now joins me via video conference for more. Abdul, first up, could you take us through this very sort of contentious and problematic 20-year history of this detention facility?
As you rightly mentioned, after the September 11 attack, US was always looking for a place where it could host the prisoners of the war without being accountable, without being held responsible for their under the US international regulations and also under the US laws. And after trying everywhere else, they finally zeroed in on Guantanamo Bay in January 2002, when the first prisoners arrived from Afghanistan primarily, but other parts, say for example, Pakistan and other parts of the world, wherever they could get hold of people they thought that responsible for what happened on 9/11. Since 2002 till now, around 750 around people have been to that detention facility, where no international, as I said before, no international law applies, no US law applies, and the only way to kind of arrive to quote unquote justice is through the military commissions, which basically have based on arbitrary rules and regulations, which are defined according to the convenience of the people involved in these things. To make it sure that this facility has been one center for one of the largest number of human rights violations ever recorded in human history in last 20 years. No due process has been followed. Prisoners have been tortured. They have been sexually abused. All kinds of things which are prohibited, which are considered inhuman, have been done to the people who have been there. And the most important thing is the majority of these people, around you can say more than 700 people, have not even been charged. They have been released after spending 10 years, 12 years of their lives in these inhuman conditions, and they have been released. So that is the legacy of the so-called war of terror, which is Guantanamo Bay.
And now around 40 prisoners still remain on this, like you rightly described it. It's an island beyond the laws. In the end of his tenure, President Barack Obama tried to or made moves towards closing down this facility, but wasn't successful. Are we realistically going to see the closure of Guantanamo Bay?
It is not only Barack Obama who tried to close it. In fact, when the global outcry happened in 2007, 2008, when what was happening in Guantanamo Bay became public, there was a global outcry, which basically forced George Bush, in his last few months in office, he tried to kind of close it. It did not happen. Then Obama promised during his election campaign that he'll come and close it. He could not, even remaining in office for 2 terms, full terms, he could not do it. Of course, we never expected Trump to close it anyway. In fact, he tried to strengthen the institutions there, and lengthen its existence. Biden says that he will close it by 2024.
Hmm.
But the circumstances which prevented Obama to deliver on his promise of closing Guantanamo Bay still exist. The basic problems are three, which basically, of course, apart from the political reasons of keeping the prison alive, because as I said, it benefits the defense establishments to kind of treat the prisoners the way they want to treat. That is a privilege they don't want to let
Let
go.
go of.
So that is there. Apart from that, there are three basic reasons which basically makes it difficult for any leader to close the facility. The first major reason is technical reason, that in order to release these prisoners, they need to have an agreement with the third party or the countries from where they belong, that they will be treated quote unquote humanely. Until that treaty is signed or the agreement is signed between these two countries, between the US and the country which will receive the prisoner, they cannot release it. That is one problem. The second problem is the US Congress has passed resolutions and passed laws which basically makes it difficult for the US administration to close the facility, transfer the prisoners out of the facility. And until those laws are revoked, it is very difficult to do it. The third and basic thing is the larger public opinion. US, though we have seen human rights people in favor of human rights mobilizations, those mobilizations are still not effective. There is a political class, there is a ruling establishment which think, particularly the representatives or the congressmen, they think that a large section of their popular base comes from this maintaining the idea of US supremacy, and Guantanamo Bay is one of that, which basically you can say the legacy of 9/11, which created a jingoistic ultranationalist feeling among a section of Americans, which is still persist. And that is a substantial vote bank, which basically prevents a lot of politicians to take right course of action and do what is required from them to do, basically.
Right. All right. Thanks very much for that, Abdul. And for more on this and all of the other stories that People's Dispatch does, you can visit our website, peoplesdispatch.org, and also, of course, follow us on all the regular social media channels. Next up, we're talking about space. So we're talking space now. On Saturday, January the 8th, a new observatory, the largest space telescope ever built, successfully unfolded its final primary mirror segment to cap what NASA has built as one of its most complicated deployments in space ever. The Webb mission team is now turning its attention to directing the telescope to its final destination while getting key parts of the observatory online for its astronomy work. Bapa Sinha, a resident science and tech geek at NewsClick, has been very excited to talk about the $10 billion telescope and joins us now via video conference. Bapa, what's the James Webb mission all about?
Yeah, so that's what is the current excitement in science and technology. So I think all of us remember the Hubble Space Telescope. That was a big deal when it was launched in, I think, way back in 1990. Yeah. And it was the first large telescope in space. And it got us pictures of distant stars and galaxies. And many scientific breakthroughs were made because of the Hubble telescope, because that telescope the Earth's atmosphere didn't interfere with that telescope because it was in space. Right. This is the James Webb telescope is basically the successor to Hubble. It's the going to the next level. The difference between the James Webb telescope and the Hubble telescope is that the Hubble telescope observed was making observations in the visible light, right? So as we know that electromagnetic radiations come in an entire spectrum, right? From ultraviolet to infrared, and light kind of is in middle of that spectrum, what we call visible light. Right. The thing about visible light spectrum, however, is that things which are very far away from us, as they move towards Earth, right? They experience what is called the redshift. So what the redshift is that we know the universe came from a big bang, and the universe is expanding. Yeah. So basically, what the universe is expanding means not just that the like stars and galaxies are moving away from us, but space itself is expanding. So as light from very distant places come towards us through an expanding space, the wavelength of the light increases, right? And as the wavelength of light increases, it moves towards towards the red side of the spectrum. Now, for things which are really far away, it moves into the infrared region. Now, if things were move into the infrared region, Hubble telescope wouldn't catch it. So the purpose of the James Webb telescope is to really observe the first stars and the first galaxies from when they were formed, right? And those are so far away from us that they have moved into the radiations from there have moved into the light from there have moved into the infrared spectrum and cannot be observed by Hubble, and so James Webb can observe them, right? I think this is slightly confusing to people, that how can we be observing something which happened billions of years away, right? So in the past, because the universe is roughly 14 billion years old. And the first stars and galaxies, I think, started forming at about, let's say, 13 billion years or 12 to 13 billion years ago. So how would this telescope let us see things from that far away? That, like, in the past, effectively, how are we looking now? So the thing is that light travels at a certain speed, right? The speed of light. Now, for you to observe anything, light or radiation from that thing has to come to us for us to be able to. So when I'm seeing a person, it's a light reflected from the person that I'm seeing. Now, if that person is a billion light years away, light will take a billion years to come to us, right?
To reach,
To reach. So basically, what we would observe today is what would have
happened
happened
a billion years ago,
right? So if this telescope is going to be able to be able to observe things which are, let's say, 13 billion light years away, then what we would see today is effectively what happened 13 billion years ago, right? So that's very exciting, right? So the hope is that with this telescope, we will be able to see stars forming and exploding 13 billion light years away. So we are effectively looking 13 billion years in the past, and that's what the excitement is about.
Yeah, no doubt. It is quite an exciting thing. So as we were saying, some bits still to go with the final deployment, and it is a quite complicated process. How soon before this telescope reaches its final destination, and sort of enthusiasts like yourself get to see the first images that come through the telescope?
So before we talk about that, let's talk about like what makes it so very complex, right? Now it is complex because, like we said, that it's going to observe in the infrared spectrum, right? Now all bodies which give out heat give out infrared radiations, right? So the sun, earth, moon, all of them are giving out infrared radiation, right? So this telescope could not hence be orbiting Earth, right? Because the radiation from the sun and the earth would be too much. And so it is being sent 1,000,000 miles away from Earth, right, to something called the Lagrange point 2. And it has a heat shield, which is the size of a tennis court, right? And it's like made from, like, it's a very complicated science to create 5 layers of this heat shield. Now, the heat shield is does such a good job that on the hot side of the heat shield, the side which is facing Earth and sun, that side, it would be 83 degrees centigrade, right? About the boiling point of water. But on the dark side, the side on which the telescope is, it would be at like minus 230, minus 240 degrees centigrade. Wow. So just 5 thin layers of this heat shield would like on one side you would have almost boiling point of water, the other side it would have one of the coldest temperatures that you can achieve, and then it has a crylo cooler on top of that, and that would bring down the temperature to about 7 Kelvin. 7 Kelvin is about minus 266 degrees centigrade. the reason we use Kelvin is in scientific terminology, 0 Kelvin is absolute zero. So that is the
Absolutely.
coldest we can get. And this will operate at 7 Kelvin. So about 7 degrees more than the absolute zero.
Absolute zero.
And at that temperature, it will be able to get like be able to capture the infrared rays from 13 billion light years away. Yeah. And also it has to have a very large mirror, because things which are so far away, the intensity of radiation from them would be very, very like dim, right? So you need a huge mirror to be able to capture the maximum amount of radiation you can capture. And so you have a mirror which is of the size of like 21 square feet, which is like, in comparison, the Hubble only had a mirror of 2 square feet, right? So there's like 10 times, the mirrors are 10 times bigger than Hubble. Now, all of this had to be packed into a small spacecraft and sent up, right? And then the deployment is all basically remote. The first few deployments were automatic, right? So there is a sun shield which came out, and the first few things are automatic. And beyond that, everything is, this telescope communicates with the Earth. And so commands are sent from the Earth to the computers on this telescope, which then deploys
processes and deploys.
There were about 300 moving parts which had to be deployed. So it was a very complicated thing. If any of those 300 steps failed, the telescope would fail, right? And it's a $10 billion project built over the last 25 years. So it was nerve-wracking, but finally, all the telescope now is more or less fully deployed. It still needs to travel, I think, roughly, it's about 80% of its distance to Lagrange point 2. So, the total, it was launched on Christmas Day, on 25th December. And the total time to reach that point in space is about 30 days, 29 days, right? And we are currently at, I think, day 15. So we are at the halfway point in terms of time, not in terms of distance. In distance, we are about 80% of the way. So we need another 14, let's say 2 weeks to go to reach the Lagrange point 2. But it's not going to be sending us pictures when it reaches Lagrange point 2. So what it will do is, it will reach Lagrange point 2 in another 14 days, which is about 1 million miles away from Earth. But after that, they will keep the telescope there for another 5 months, for allowing the telescope to cool down, right? Because it is packed in Earth and sent in a spaceship. It had like the Earth's temperature, right? But it's going to let it cool down to whatever that minus 7 Kelvin, or and it'll let 5 months go by. After those 5 months, it will start capturing whatever it observes from billions of light years away. Hopefully, with that, we will be able to see the first galaxies, like evidence of the first galaxies forming and the first stars forming. Apparently, the first few stars which were formed were giant stars, which then exploded in these stars exploded in things which are called supernovas, which are like giant star explosions. And the hope is that we will be able to observe those things. And hopefully that will lead to advancement, like the next phase of advancement in science and our understanding of the universe and advances in astronomy and physics. So these are very exciting times.
Yeah, but still, like you pointed out, some time to go. So you'll have to contain that excitement for another few months. But we'll catch up with you again. Thanks for that update, Baba, and good to have you back on the show. And finally, for the latest on the global situation with regard to the Omicron variant of COVID-19, my man Prashant spoke earlier to NewsClick Editor-in-Chief Prabir Purkayastha. Let's listen in.
Thank you, Prabir, so much for joining us. So I think we're a few weeks into Omicron cases being recorded across the world. Of course, I think one of the major questions on people's minds, which has been there throughout this bout, is right now, do we see cases rising quickly? We see cases rising quickly, of course, across the world, the United States, even India for that matter, where the numbers have risen quite sharply, at least in the metros. The key question really here is that do we also expect the numbers to fall as steeply as they seem to be in South Africa? So are we looking at the possibility of huge peaks and an immediate fall after that, or does this also look like this might take many months like in Delta?
Well, two characteristics of this current wave is very clear. One is that it rises very, very fast. There is no question that it has overtaken in most of the countries that we see a sharp rise, and there is going to be lag between countries on this, and also within the cities and other cities, some cities and the countryside. So all this is the complex nature of the pandemic. But looking at the steep rise that we are seeing in different parts of the world, it's definitely going to overtake the Delta wave. There's no question about that. Already the United States has well passed it. So is France, so is UK, and so is likely to be India in the coming days. So I think that trend is very clear, that we see almost a vertical rise, and this is where Omicron seems to be much more transmissible, as well as what is called vaccine escape, meaning those who are vaccinated are also falling, at least showing symptoms, or at least even if not showing symptoms, seem to be infected. So we are seeing the Omicron spread taking over the world. And it's clear that it is going to be the dominant strain, if it is not already, in most of the countries which we see this vertical rise. So that is one part of it. The second part of it, which you raised, is it also going to wane as fast as, for instance, it did in South Africa? Now, one thing we must be clear about, that it is not countries who actually rise and fall. It's really cities, neighborhoods, localities, and smaller areas which actually are connected to each other through human beings, that we see this rapid rise take place. And those who are not so closely connected may follow with a lag, or more slowly because the connections may be weaker, the rural population, for example. So we have to really watch what happens, not to countries, but to really cities at this stage of the pandemic. What is striking is, even so early, when it is only striking the cities largely, that even then the numbers are exceeded by far, by significant amount, at least in the United States, UK, and France, the numbers that they had earlier, the Delta wave. So that is one part of it. The waning part, which is the other part you've asked, now South Africa has two differences. It has a younger population, and I think that has to be taken on board. Secondly, it is southern hemisphere. That means people are not cooped up in their houses in enclosed spaces, but they're much more out in the open. Even if they meet at homes, probably their windows are open. So given all of that, that means that the infection is not going to be spreading the way it has in the northern hemisphere. And I think northern hemisphere will show differences. The third part of it, when we talk about, now let's move away from this part regarding the infections and the waning part of it. Waning, we'll have to see. There is no question that waning, we're not following the South African pattern. Yes, some peaking is now visible, say, for instance, in London and possibly in New York, but it is certainly a much slower waning than what happened in South Africa. So it does seem that the numbers not only will go up, but will stay up for some time. The third point, which is not related to the rise and fall, but to what we are seeing as a characteristic of this particular variant, the argument has been is that the Omicron is possibly less dangerous than the Delta variant or the other variants, and therefore people are not falling very seriously ill. From the beginning, the argument had been that this is difficult to say because some people have already a certain degree of immunity by virtue of earlier infections, like, for instance, Djokovic, the tennis player, and therefore claiming he doesn't need vaccines, or because you've received two vaccines and therefore you have some immunity, or a combination of the two. Now, in this particular case, of course, yes, the infection now with Omicron may not cause a serious illness as it did with earlier. And that's because your body still remembers, the immune system of your body still remembers the virus, even though it is a variant, and therefore it immediately may not recognize it, but it still does recognize, and therefore is able to fight it. But the numbers of hospitalization figures that we see in the United States, again, taking United States and UK as the advance guard of the wave, so to say, it does seem that the the public health systems, for example, in Maryland, is getting overwhelmed. The numbers that you are beginning to see in many hospitals is overwhelming the hospitals, because hospital staff are also falling ill and they have been under pressure for quite some time. So already the hospitals seem to be under siege in different parts where the wave has really taken off. And therefore, it will mean that it is going to affect the hospital system badly. And therefore, the crisis is not of Omicron. The crisis is really of the hospital system feeling the pressure of the new cases. Two other things about this particular hospital pressures. One is, of course, that the number of hospital staff get affected itself has an impact. And because it's so infectious, even the hospital staff get infected very quickly. So that poses a problem for the hospital itself. The second part of it is that in the United States, for example, and that's true for other countries as well, but particularly in the United States, there are large pockets of people who are not vaccinated, who refuse to be vaccinated, either because they don't believe in vaccination, or they have a political right, they believe to assert that they will not get vaccinated. It's like carrying guns, even if guns causes a lot of deaths. They don't believe that they should give up that right. So they also believe that they should give up the right not to get vaccines in their bodies. Now, because of that, of course, that's a population which is prone now to an attack by any new virus that will arise. And it is also true that hospitals seem to be seeing disproportionate serious cases coming from these segments who are not vaccinated and may have also on top of that comorbidities. So I think that's something we'll have to watch. So the crisis is not going to be of people falling ill. That's only one part of it. Real crisis is when the hospital system collapses. And that's what we'll have to watch, because the Omicron wave is going to be much bigger than whatever the Delta wave was. So that is, I think, what is going to be the real problem.
Thank you so much, Prabir.
All right, that's all we have on the show today. From me and the entire People's Dispatch team, you've been watching Daily Debrief. Thanks very much for watching. We'll be back again, same place, same time tomorrow. Until then, stay safe. Goodbye.